I want to turn attention, I will be turning attention to the Decalogue in particular and examining that and growing in appreciation for it. I think there's some beauty in it, and most people don't talk about the law this way, but there's beauty in it that we ought to recognize. Before I get there, though, I want to talk a little bit more about understanding law in general, okay? So one part of that is to understand uses of the law, if you will. So one classic understanding of the uses of the law would be, one use is to expose and convict of sin, to lead people to Christ, right? So use or purpose of the law, to expose and convict of sin and lead people to Christ. A second part of the classic summary here would be to restrain sin. A function or purpose or use of the law is to restrain sin. And by the way, thinking about those, well, I'll say the third use of the law or function of the law is often associated with Calvin and understood in Reformed thinking as perhaps the most important use of the law is instruction on the will of God, right? That the law teaches us God's will, even those laws like the parapet around the roof that may not be directly applicable today. So thinking about those three things together, think about that the law does actually restrain sin, and the law exposes sin and can convict of sin, okay? Now, there's a discussion sometimes, and often the statement that we'll hear is that you can't legislate morality, right? Now, how should we answer that? In part, the answer is yes, you can, and we do, all right? That in some sense, a lot of our legislation is just that. It's legislating morality, okay? So the question is, what morality are you legislating, all right? Now, another answer to that is, no, you can't legislate morality in the heart, right? So now you have to understand morality is not only actions, but attitudes, heart, virtues, things like that. And yeah, you can legislate against murder. That's legislating morality. You can't really legislate against hate, right? I mean, you can't see it. You can't identify it. You can see it sometimes because it explodes and that. But you can't find and penalize somebody for hating. And which is, by the way, one of the interesting things in the contemporary discussion of religious liberty is increasingly you have people conceiving of religious liberty as the right to believe whatever you want. That's not true religious liberty. That's part of religious liberty, but that's not true religious liberty. It's the practice of religion that is protected, right? And so if you legislate that out, you're legislating morality in a different way. Let me get at this in another way, is that to make abortion legal is in effect to say it's moral. Now, some people would say, no, you can make things legal that you're not saying are moral, like you might say pornography or something like that, and you might find it distasteful or immoral, but you don't think that you should have a law against it. There are those categories. But the way that people understand things, it's just the nature of law, that if it's legal, many people will understand it to be morally okay. And if it's illegal, they'll understand it to be morally wrong. Not only that, but there's a fear of doing wrong, right? So the reality is that if prior to Roe v. Wade, when abortion is illegal, except for certain reasons, and it varied state by state and that sort of thing, many women did not get abortions who otherwise would have. And you have some people who are advocating for, abortion on demand or no restrictions on abortions, who would say that the same number of women would get abortions whether it's legal or not. They just either get them in a doctor's office or in a back alley. That's simply not true, okay? So my point here is to say that one of the functions of law is that it shapes morality. And it doesn't fully, but it does shape morality, okay? So, secondly, in understanding biblical law, we need to see that it's fulfilled in Christ. And we see this, we'll be looking at this text another time from Matthew 5:17-20. Jesus says, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And there's a question about how we understand what Jesus means by fulfilling the law. But I would simply say, to begin with here, is that he fulfills it in multiple ways. One is that the law has a prophetic nature to it that points to Christ. And think about especially sacrificial laws, but also what are labeled as purity laws and so forth that point to Christ. But then also Jesus fulfills the law in having kept the law perfectly. And so we can think about that in different ways, but the law is fulfilled in Christ. And ultimately, we ought to understand the law in light of Christ then. We also should understand the law through the love command, or I should say the double love command, right? So Jesus says that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. So one of the things that we ought to do when we are looking at Old Testament law is to remind ourselves that this law points to love or enacts love, right? It hangs on love, okay? In fact, we ought to understand a couple things here. One is that the details in the law point to love. This is what it is to love. And also, if we want to understand how to love your neighbor as yourself, we can look at the law in the Old Testament and it fills that in nicely. So that even if we don't keep it in exactly the same way because some laws are abrogated or some laws are changed or whatever, it does show us what love looks like. In fact, it's interesting, isn't it, that it is in the holiness code in Leviticus 18:20 that this second greatest commandment appears. Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself. It's kind of a stop and summarize what the laws have been dealing with there in Leviticus 19. And it's in a sense saying, the sum of it is love your neighbor as yourself. This is what we're getting at, okay? So understood through the love command. And if there's a law that, let me pause here for a second. If there's a law that it's hard to understand, like this doesn't seem like a loving command or something, we just need to go and think more about it, to try to understand how did it function. And so that's getting at this next point is discerning the purpose and function of various laws in their context. And so I raised this law from Deuteronomy 22:8 that commands the people of Israel to build a parapet around their roofs. Right? So this wall or a fence, it would be a wall on the roof. And the failure to do so could mean a pretty harsh penalty up to death. That seems like this must have been a pretty important thing, right? Why? Why this wall around the roof so important? Well, it's because in Israel, you would have had flat roofs and people on them, right? And which is true in many parts of the world today, where you might be drying clothes or you might have a table and chairs and eat on the roof or sit and children might play on there. And so if there wasn't a wall around the roof, it would be dangerous indeed. So if someone fell off and was killed, that's why there's a penalty that may be up to death, because that was foreseeable and you didn't care for your neighbor enough. So you see how that's a love your neighbor as yourself. To love your neighbor is to protect them with this. So it's not that difficult to discern the purpose and function of some laws in their context, and then they can be applied in contemporary situations. Sometimes directly. You know, there's sort of a clear application where there's some area of public safety and risk and things like that, and there's things that we can do to protect people from harm. And I use the illustration in the chapter in my book about legislation that came through, I think mostly in the 80s, it started coming in, where if you had a swimming pool, even in your own backyard, legislation came in that you had to build a fence around it, right? And a lot of people were not happy with that because it costs money and it's, after all, in my yard. But I think that was a reasonable legislation. And it fits as a nice parallel with building a parapet around the roof. So I think Christians could see that and say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And here's a clear application. Sometimes the application isn't as clear, and so we need to have some kind of analogy to draw or think through how we might apply it. Next point I would say is that in understanding the Old Testament law, the Decalogue is at the center of the Old Testament law. Okay? And so I want to say a few things about the Decalogue before I get into talking about specific laws in the Decalogue. But the Decalogue in the center of the Old Testament law. So here's a question for you. Why do we refer to 10 commandments? Why 10? And the reason that's a question is because if we look at Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 5, where the 10 commandments are given, there's more than 10 commands in the 10 commandments. Isn't that interesting? So I'll just put these up. You can look on your own time and count them out yourself. But here's an example from Exodus 20 where you might count 13 commandments in the 10 commandments, okay? So again, it brings us back to the question, so why does it say 10 then? Have we been getting this wrong all along? And the reason we say 10, the 10 commandments, or the Decalogue, is because the text refers to 10. So Aseret Hadbarim means 10 words. And here's an example in Exodus 34:28. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, Aseret Hadbarim, the 10 commandments, or the 10 words. Okay? So that's why 10. A question you may not have had, but now you have the answer to. Inquiring minds want to know. And this is why in Greek, the Decalogue is deca meaning 10, logos, word or words. Okay, so Decalogue. Now, it's interesting because there are different accounts. There's different ways to count to 10. Okay? Now, this is a bit confusing, but in the notes, in the outline, I have this same chart so you can see this. And so I'll just call attention to a couple of things here. You notice that, so I have the Reformed kind of traditional view, Catholic Lutheran view in the middle, and then the Jewish view. In the Jewish view, and this is from Deuteronomy 5, the first command is understood to be, I am the Lord your God, which doesn't sound like a command. It sounds more like an assertion, right? But now think back. It's Aseret Hadbarim, or Decalogue, 10 words. So this is the first word, right? And this lays the foundation for what follows, okay? But if that's counted as the first word, I didn't even count that, I don't think, in my 13 commands. So that'd be 14. So then how do you count 9 more? Well, in the Jewish counting, what most of us here would understand to be the first 2 commandments would be considered one. In other words, you shall have no other gods before me is part of the same command as you shall not make for yourself an idol. Because if you have no other gods before Yahweh, you don't have idols. If you don't have idols, you have no gods before Yahweh, right? So then the rest counts as most of us would be accustomed to counting them. Now, if you look in the middle column for the Catholic Lutheran view, they would agree with what most of us are familiar with, that first statement, I am the Lord your God, is sort of prologue. But they would agree with the Jewish counting that the first 2 commands, as we normally see them, are 1. So then you got the opposite issue. Okay, so they need to count 9 more where we start on 3, right? And the way they do that is they see 2 commandments on coveting. So one commandment on coveting is coveting your neighbor's spouse. So in other words, there's lust. And then the second one is really greed, coveting your neighbor's property. What's interesting there is that the Catholic and Lutheran views flip-flop those because the Catholic view follows Deuteronomy and the Lutheran view follows Exodus in order. And so and even that, it's not entirely neat because it goes back from property to spouse to property. But that's how they would come to that. So you can see how that's compared. And just to summarize these things, you can see David Clyde Jones in his book Biblical Christian Ethics addresses this briefly. Ron Youngblood has an article on this, Counting the Ten Commandments, from 1994. But basically, in the Jewish account, there's the first word, which is different. There's one word on worship and one on coveting. In the Roman Catholic Lutheran account, there's two words on sexual immorality, right? Because if there's, you shall not commit adultery, but then also you shall not lust, you shall not covet your neighbor's spouse. That's two words on sexual immorality, and two on coveting, as I've already mentioned, and one on worship, and then one that we're largely familiar with, a Reform view, two words on worship, one on coveting. Okay, now that said, that's just a kind of a quick aside. If you were to hold to traditional view, one of the problems that we run into there is somehow holding the moral law out from the rest of the law. And is it legitimate to do that? Well, I'll show you how the traditional view would come to that, beyond what I've already said. And I think you start to see that this isn't exactly a stretch. So, first, Old Testament focus. The most obvious thing, so now I think if you went back and could talk to somebody in Israel, maybe they would understand what you're talking about if you're talking about the moral law, if you use different words perhaps, because did you catch the thing with, he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 words, Aseret Hadbarim, that all of a sudden sets apart the 10 commandments, right? In other words, it doesn't say he wrote on the tablet the words of the covenant, the law, or the 613, or whatever the precise number is, right? So it does stand out. Also, just the circumstances around the giving of the 10 Commandments, the tablets, the references to the direct imprint of God, written by the finger of God, those kinds of things are significant. The storm and all the event that is taken up there seems that you could have a conversation with somebody in Israel and say, yeah, this is a distinct part of the law, right? Partly because, as we'll see, it's the foundation, and then you've got case law that applies and flows out from the Decalogue. The tablets are placed in the ark. That's significant, right? That they're carried with them. And I think it's rather incredible that, again, going back to Exodus 34:28, he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 words. So in that sense, the 10 Commandments are a shorthand for the covenant. They're equated with the covenant. That's amazing, right? Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of the law isn't, but in terms of shorthand, that says something. So that's the Old Testament focus. I'll say something about the New Testament focus, which obviously is significant if people are to hold to the traditional view. And both Jesus and Paul appeal to the Decalogue as the standard and summary of moral behavior, in a sense. Okay, so when Jesus is asked which laws to keep, he turns to the Decalogue, saying, you shall not commit murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother. All right? And remember, the rich young man says, all these have I kept. Right? But the point is, Jesus' reference there is to the Decalogue. Also, Matthew 15:19, he says, out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, slanders. So a lot of scholars see this an allusion to the Decalogue in these, and that's not hard to see. So that's a couple of statements from Jesus. Paul says in Romans 13, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. And then to expound on that, Paul says, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And he says if there's any other command, it's summed up in the command to love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so Romans 13. And then there's 1 Timothy 1, 8 to 11. Again, an allusion to the Decalogue. Paul says, the law is for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane. They're an allusion to the first tablet of the Decalogue. For those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers and immoral men, and homosexuals and kidnappers and liars and perjurers. So again, a lot of scholars see in there an allusion to the Decalogue, and some of it's pretty plain. All right. Let me give you a couple of summary statements from advocates of this view. So David Clyde Jones, I've referred to him before. The Ten Commandments are universal moral norms because they represent the will of God for human nature as He created it, to be fulfilled through His ordinances of worship, rest, authority, life, sex, property, and communication. They are grounded in His purposes and instructions for human beings always and everywhere. Effectively, he's saying, these are universal moral norms, and they cover the whole span of life. We're going to look at this, or I'll refer to this again another time, but think about it. It refers to worship, rest, authority, life, sex, property, and communication. Just broad moral categories. Another one from John Murray. John Murray's Principles of Conduct. And he says, the Ten Commandments furnish the core of the biblical ethic. They were but the concrete and practical form of enunciating principles which did not then for the first time come to have relevance, but were relevant from the beginning. As they did not begin to have relevance at Sinai, so they did not cease to have relevance when the Sinaitic economy had passed away. So John Murray, Principles of Conduct. It always reminds me of, in the foreword to a recent edition of Principles of Conduct, J.I. Packer has glowing things to say about John Murray and says something like, he would have been considered, this is my paraphrase, and it's much more eloquent and fair-minded coming from Packer, but it says something like, he would have been considered one of the great theologians of the 20th century, basically, if he wrote in a way that we could understand. So you kind of see this in there, enunciating principles and things like that. But what Murray is saying is that when the Decalogue was given, these commands weren't invented. The moral law wasn't then invented. Rather, they articulated what was true, right? And so when the Mosaic, I'll say, the Mosaic covenant was replaced with the new covenant, these didn't cease to have authority, okay? Now, there's an interesting text that some scholars refer to that I want to turn to just very quickly in Genesis 26, that some scholars will say this supports this point. I just find it rather interesting. So Isaac is addressed, and the text, Genesis 26, 4 and 5 says, I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. I will give your offspring all these lands, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring, because, here's why, because Abraham listened to my voice and kept my mandate, my commands, my statutes, and my instructions. Now, it's interesting, right? Because the Decalogue hadn't been given. The Mosaic Law hadn't been given. So what's he referring to with my mandate, my commands, my statutes, and my instructions? Because those are terms used of the Mosaic Law, right? So it's interesting. And of course, scholars who don't have a high view of Scripture will say, well, this is a redaction, right? This was just added by an editor, because clearly this didn't exist there. Well, if that's not the option, then what is it? Well, Abraham was certainly aware of God's commands, God's mandates and commands and statutes and instructions, and he kept them. But what are those commands? Because what we have in Genesis isn't that detailed, right? Abram was commanded to go to the land that God sent him, and he did that. Abram was commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac, and he was willing to do that, and God stopped him, right? But it seems that what Genesis 26:5 is referring to is much more than that. And so some scholars would say that here is an indication of the moral law that Abram was aware of. Now, some scholars will try to go through Genesis and find specific reference to each of the Ten Commandments. Some are more, I think, credible than others. Some just seem to be a bit of a stretch. I don't find that to be a necessary or helpful exercise. It might be interesting in some points, but I don't think to establish a traditional view or to see the usefulness of the traditional view, you would have to establish all 10 given in the text prior to the Decalogue, prior to the Mosaic Law being given.